Welcome back, everybody. Our crews and cameras caught up with candidate Donald Trump in Illinois for an interview with Bloomberg News at the Economic Club of Chicago. Here's Mr. Trump answering the question on why Americans should trust him with the national debt.
President Trump, thank you for doing this, as we said, and you heard the reception there. The business people of Chicago, like everywhere else, they like a lot of the things you want to do in terms of tax cuts and some of the spending proposals, but like many business people, what they're often worried about is the cost. And the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is a bipartisan outfit, put out some predictions the other day. If you add up all the promises you've made, and your plans would add $7.5 trillion to the debt. That's more than twice the total for Vice President Harris. You're on course to push up debt up to 150% of GDP. This is a very business-like audience.
Yeah.
Why should they trust you with that?
Because we're about growth. She's got no growth whatsoever, and we're all about growth. We're going to bring companies back to our country. You look at, even today, as I was driving over, I see these empty, old, beautiful, like steel mills and factories that are empty and falling down. Some have been converted to senior citizens' homes, but that's not going to do the trick. And we're going to bring the companies back. We're going to lower taxes still further for companies that are going to make their product in the USA. We're going to protect those companies with strong tariffs, because I'm a believer in tariffs. I'm not sure that you are. I don't think you are, but I congratulate you on your career. But to me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favorite word. It needs a public relations firm to help it, but to me, it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
Tariffs, do you think that will bring in the revenues? To use another bipartisan group,
Yeah.
Peterson Institute, they say they only bring in $200 billion. That is that's barely the cost of two of your promises.
Yeah, but that's like, for what company are you talking about, okay? Look, I've brought in with tariffs, and I was just getting started. Then COVID came, and we had because I tell you what, I did a very good job in COVID. Nobody knew what the hell it was. I call it the China virus because I like being a little more accurate. But when that came, but we got hundreds of billions of dollars just from China alone, and I hadn't even started yet. But tariffs are two things, if you look at it. Number one is for protection of the companies that we have here and the new companies that will move in, because we're going to have thousands of companies coming into this country. We're going to grow it like it's never grown before, and we're going to protect them when they come in, because we're not going to have somebody undercut them. And I could give you an example of this if you want. Would you like me to? Because it just
Give me a quick example, then I will come back.
I just found out about it. So I've been talking about for the last year about Detroit and how horribly it has been. It's just horrible, because we've been talking about Detroit's coming back for 40 years, and it's never come back. And it's very dependent on the car industry. Well, they've lost 60% of the business over a long period of time. And what happened is I found out a friend of mine builds auto plants. That's all he does. He builds auto plants. That's what he's good at. He doesn't want to build an apartment. All he wants to build is, and he builds the biggest in the world. And for the last year and a half, if anybody's heard me speak, I was talking about Mexico as a tremendous challenge for us right now. Tremendous. China is building massive auto plants in Mexico. And they're going to build them, and they're going to take those cars and sell them into the United States. They're very near the border, and they're going to have all the advantages and none of the disadvantages. And that's going to be the end of Michigan. It's going to be the end of, frankly, South Carolina. Going to be the end of everything. So I've been talking about this, and I said to him about 9 months ago, I said, you know what? I want you to do me a favor, John. His name is John. I don't want to give his last name because he might not like it. But I said, I want to see an auto plant. I want to go and see one of these. You press a button and everything works, right? I want to see one of the big ones. He said, all right, good. I said, where do we go? I'd like to go to Michigan. I'd like to go to someplace in the United States. He said, no, we can't do that. Why? We're not building anything big in the United States. That's not where we don't build the big ones here. I said, where are you building the biggest ones? He said, in Mexico. We're building giant plants, the biggest plants anywhere in the world. In Mexico, I said. So you mean they're going to make cars cheaply? They have advantages over labor and other things, and they're going to sell them into the United States, and they're going to put Michigan out of business. Is that what? I don't know anything about that. All I do is build the plants. If you want to see a plant, we'll go to Mexico. I'll show you the biggest plant in the world. That was 9 months ago. I saw him, and I talked about it all the time because I think it's a serious threat to our country, because not only autos, but other things. So then I see him. 2 days ago, I was talking at another club, very nice club, and like this, except, I don't know, I think you people are probably even wealthier, okay? This was in Detroit, okay, which was appropriate. And I was showing them all sorts of charts about how their car, it's just gone down. It's like terrible. And I saw him, and I said, "Oh, how are you doing? How have you been?" I said, "Could I ask you, how are those plants that you mentioned, those giant plants that you're building in Mexico, how is that coming along? Have you finished them?" "No, sir. They abandoned the project when they heard you're running. They abandoned the project when they saw that you were winning and doing well." I said, "Wow, isn't that beautiful?"
All the same.
Because I told them, and I said it publicly, they're not going to sell one car into the United States. I said, if I run this country, if I'm going to be president of this country, I'm going to put a 100, 200, 2,000% tariff. They're not going to sell one car into the United States because we're not going to destroy our country. Because I know you're an anti-tariff guy, but I'm the exact opposite. If I had, there was no other way I could have stopped them other than, what am I going to do, negotiate with Mexico or China? You're not going to get anything from that. I said I'm going to put a 100, 200, or 300. I'm going to put the highest tariff in history, meaning I'm going to stop them from ever selling a car into the United States. So I just see the guy by accident. I see him. He says, "Sir, they've abandoned and by the way, they built foundations. They were really rocking. They were going to do it. They thought that I was going to win, or maybe they're just holding off." I tell you this, if I don't win, those factories are going to wipe out this country. They're the biggest factories ever built for cars. They're going to wipe out our country. If she wins, and she doesn't know what the hell she's doing. If she wins, she's not going to be thinking about, I couldn't, every speech I made having to do with cars, but every speech I made having to do with tariffs, I'd mentioned that our country is being threatened by Mexico. Now, all of those things, beyond even the car companies, all of those things are now dead. They're dead. I asked him, will they start? Probably not. They're dead as a doornail. If she gets in, it'll start up again.
President Trump, I'll let you give your example.
No,
you talked a lot about tariffs. You look at the American economy, 40 million jobs rely on trade. It accounts for 27% of GDP.
Okay.
If you cut that off, that's also going to have an effect on many, many business people here.
Yeah.
Tariffs also have another side. Isn't that something that you have to acknowledge?
No.
You could be plunging America into the...
You're listening to former President Donald Trump talking to the Economic Club of Chicago there. CBS News 24/7 producers will be listening in the background to any news-making items that the former president has to say. 3 weeks ago until Election Day, talking the economy, it's a very big deal. As soon as we see some of those news-making headlines, we can turn it around to you quickly. That's what we do here on this broadcast. But now let's turn our focus to the White House. President Joe Biden set to travel to Pennsylvania today. And CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand live on the stream with us. Natalie, you're watching Pennsylvania and that much-desired electoral vote there. What can we expect from Joe Biden's remarks in Philly tonight?
Yeah, well, he'll be speaking at a fundraiser this evening. And Reed, I don't have to tell you, but this is arguably the most important state in this presidential election cycle. This is a key battleground that President Biden narrowly won in 2020. Former President Donald Trump won it in 2016, both times by fewer than 100,000 votes. That's why we are seeing so many resources, time, energy, money poured into Pennsylvania with both presidential candidates there just yesterday. We learned Vice President Harris will be returning tomorrow to Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is considered one of the most swing districts in the entire country. So I think we can expect that President Biden will really continue to make the case for what his administration, arguing what he has accomplished and saying that a Harris administration would continue on that path as he's doing whatever he can to try to help her campaign in a state, again, where he had success last time around.
Natalie, out on the campaign trail, the Biden-Harris administration, they are being asked a lot about the Middle East. We want to ask you about this. The White House is urging Israel to do more to protect civilians in their battles. But at the same time, the White House is sending support for Israel. What is the White House stance where this is concerned?
Yeah, this is one of the most challenging, delicate situations this administration has faced. Of course, the president, the administration, making it clear that U.S. support for Israel is ironclad and that it will continue to help Israel defend itself in the face of continued threats by Iran and its proxies. But at the same time, it has also warned that Israel needs to take more care when it comes to how it carries out operations. Just yesterday, the NSC put out a statement reacting to the Israeli strike on a hospital in Gaza where there was video of burning civilians, and the NSC saying that, this was deeply disturbing. We've made our concerns clear to the Israeli government that Israel has a responsibility to do more to avoid civilian casualties. This is a message that they've said all along. And at the same time, they're doing what they can, sending missile defense systems to Israel in case Iran attacks again. And, as everyone waits to see how Israel will carry out what's expected to be a strike and retaliation for Iran's recent attack, that could lead to more retaliation. So obviously tensions at an all-time high here. And there are also new reports, Reed, coming in today by outlets, including the Associated Press, that the U.S. has threatened to suspend some arms deliveries to Israel if the humanitarian situation in Gaza does not improve. We are expecting to be able to speak to some NSC officials later this hour. We're also going to be monitoring the State Department briefing, so we will continue to press for answers to some of those questions.
Complicated issue, tricky news, and really it sets us up to be kind of grateful for the next item I want to ask you about. Natalie, we understand you're using the latest high-tech tools to track a couple of flying panda, a very serious political story here. What can you tell us about the significance and the hype where this headline is concerned?
Well, I can tell you that as the mother of a toddler, we are extremely excited in my household for this special delivery into Washington, D.C. today. And really, the entire region is excited. You can see them there arriving into Dulles this morning. Interesting to note, Reed, that the zoo is actually closed today for this much anticipated arrival of these two pandas. You may remember that last year the pandas had to leave because an agreement with China lapsed. This is now, new generation of panda diplomacy, a new start for these two pandas. One of them is actually the son of a mommy panda who used to live at the National Zoo as well. So, this is obviously a lighthearted story that makes a lot of people happy, but it is also a form of diplomacy, panda diplomacy, if you will. And last year when that agreement lapsed, tensions were high between the U.S. and China. Now we have a new agreement, new pandas coming into town, and everyone is celebrating that, Reed.
We'll take a win and a lighter story whenever we can get it in these times. And I say they've traveled a long way. Fresh bamboo, white linen service, stat. Natalie Brand, thank you so much for that live report. We appreciate it. All right, well, the State Department expected to give an update any moment now on so many of these issues that Natalie highlighted. We'll bring it to you live on CBS News 24/7. Jumping the map now to the state of Florida, and in the wake of Hurricane Milton floodwaters, they continue to be a problem. They are actually inching higher in some areas, believe it or not. However, we are seeing some improvement. We're hearing state roads have been cleared, gas stations are back open, and students are heading back to school. Here's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
We've now had over 4 million accounts restored to power since Hurricane Milton came. That is the fastest that's ever been done for that many accounts. And so you're even without power for a few hours, it could be a real pain in the rear end. But we had over 50,000 linemen. These folks really got to work. So you got about 170,000 accounts right now that are without power. Looks like a majority of those are TECO, but you also have some with FP&L and Duke. And, you know, the co-ops, they got it done very quickly. And they didn't have as many as the investor-owned utilities, but they did a really good job, and they brought in a lot of people as well.
All right, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis there, CBS News national correspondent Dave Malkoff joins us live now from Manasota Key, Florida. Dave, we know there's a lot of sand piled up where you are. The digging out is going to take weeks and months. Tell us about the process you're seeing.
It is, Reed. Just 27 miles down the beach is where this monster hurricane made landfall. But if you're talking about a hurricane with 120-mile-an-hour sustained winds and also 180-mile-an-hour gusts, this is what it does, Reed. These boulders were placed here, according to some of the residents back here, a guy named Mr. Webb. He tells me that these boulders were here 5 years ago as a wave break to stop the waves from pushing up into the houses. But Reed, I'm not sure if you can see, but look at where the boulders ended up, being pushed by the massive storm surge into these homes and breaking them apart. So these boulders basically became just like shotgun pellets, large shotgun pellets the size of maybe even small refrigerators, just flying into these homes. And that is the destruction that we're seeing. A lot of people are going to have to spend a lot of time cleaning up from this. We're told the people who live in this house, they live in Sarasota part-time. Some of the other people live in other homes part-time. But if you look up and down the beach, and Olivia will show you this house right here, all that's left is that interior cinder block section right there. And there's going to be a lot of cleanup ahead for these folks, even though they've got the power back on, they've got more gas, and they've also started to take the sand off the roadways. But it's going to be a long time. We got 2 hurricanes that came through here, one after the other, and it's hard to clean up from that, Reed.
You know, Dave, in the days leading up to this hurricane, we heard so often Governor DeSantis and so many others saying that phrase that Floridians know: run from the water, hide from the wind. You can see the force of the water and the wind. If it's that powerful to pick up that many boulders and push them up into a house, that's why the warnings. I want to talk to you about the recovery efforts. We're hearing Governor DeSantis saying that roads are now cleared, at least those state roads, lights slowly beginning to come back on. But from your vantage point, and you're talking to the people who live there,
let's just walk over here.
What are they needed to do to actually come back to normal, Dave?
Oh, Reed, if we can walk a little bit over here, you're talking about the roads coming back up to normal, but this is a road that's here in town. This is called Friendship Lane. And you can see what happened to Friendship Lane right here. This is just broken apart, and that is the power of the storm surge. Right here, there's a giant tree that came down on this house. So not only do they have to get the sand and debris off the roads, but in some cases, in the case of Friendship Lane, that road itself has been broken apart. The road is debris.
Wow. Dave Malkoff with a picture of what is going to be priority number 1 in that community and so many communities in Florida. Thank you so much, as always. Excellent and very vivid reporting there. All right, so our monitors now take us back to the State Department, where Matthew Miller is taking questions on U.S. support for Israel. Let's listen in.
So,
really? There's so
Matt?
much going on.
And I expect your
you
questions will fully cover everything. Give me
done
the chance to expound on all of those things.
All right. Well, let's start with this warning to the Israelis about improving humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza. What can you tell us about this?
A few things. So first, the Secretary did write, along with Secretary of Defense Austin, to the Defense Minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant, and the Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, on Sunday to make clear our concerns about the levels of humanitarian assistance that have been making it into Gaza. This was a letter we consider to be a private diplomatic communication that we did not intend to make public from our side, but Now that it is public, I am happy to confirm it and speak to it to some extent. I think you have to put this letter in the context of our ongoing and long-lasting communications and concerns about the levels of humanitarian assistance that have made it to Palestinian civilians. If you go back to April, the Secretary wrote at the time to Minister Gallant to make clear that we had seen the levels of humanitarian assistance plateau, and then after they plateaued, start to decline, and made clear that at the time that the levels were unacceptable and that we needed to see Israel implement changes. They did make changes. The changes that they made caused humanitarian assistance to increase. We got up to somewhere between 300 to 400 trucks going in on some days to Gaza. But the thing that the Secretary also made clear at the time is that the increase couldn't be a one-off, that it needed to be sustained. And what we have seen over the past few months is that the level of humanitarian assistance has not been sustained. In fact, it has fallen by over 50% from where it was at its peak. So the Secretary, along with Secretary Austin, thought it was appropriate to make clear to the government of Israel that there are changes that they need to make again to see that the level of assistance making it into Gaza comes back up from the very, very low levels that it is at today.
And the consequence, if they don't do that, is what?
So I'm not going to speak to that today. Obviously, we made clear when we released our report that was mandated under National Security Memorandum 20 that there are provisions under U.S. law that require us to make certain certifications, and to make those certifications, we have to see that Israel is not arbitrarily denying humanitarian assistance making it into Gaza. When the Secretary made his conclusions under that report in April, he did so based on the changes that we had seen them put into place and the increased levels of humanitarian assistance. But of course, those levels of humanitarian assistance have to be sustained.
Yeah, but what's the consequence?
There are implications under U.S. law, under policy, that I'm not going to speak to here, largely because we hope that Israel makes the changes that the Secretary outlined in the letter. We have seen Israel make changes before, and when they make changes, humanitarian assistance can increase. And we have seen Israel just in the past few months work with humanitarian organizations to implement a polio vaccination campaign inside Gaza. So we know that it's possible to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza. We know it can be done. We know that the various logistical and bureaucratic obstacles can be surmounted. And so it is incumbent upon the government of Israel to surmount those challenges and get assistance in.
I mean, you say that there are implications to it. I mean, obviously, under U.S. law, that's assistance. Is there specific assistance that come under scrutiny?
So I don't want to deal with any hypotheticals. You are right that it's just a plain reading of U.S. law. If you look at the provisions of U.S. law, that we are required to conduct assessments and find that recipients of U.S. military assistance do not arbitrarily deny or impede the provisioning of U.S. humanitarian assistance. That's just the law, and we, of course, will follow the law. But our hope is that Israel will make the changes that we have outlined and that we have recommended, and that the result of those changes will be a dramatic increase in humanitarian assistance. Ultimately, we are focused on the bottom line here. It's just it. Humanitarian assistance had been low. The changes that we had recommended had gotten it up, and those levels have not been sustained. And so we need to see further changes by the government of Israel.
I mean, obviously the timing of this, I know you don't explicitly do politics, but there's an election coming up here. To what extent is that a factor? I mean, 30 days from now would be after the U.S. election. It's been a year since the conflict has been ongoing. The president has repeatedly warned Israel about assistance, about civilian casualties, with at best mixed results sometimes. This happened just 30 days before the election. I mean, to what extent was the election a factor?
This is not a factor at all. The bottom line is we felt it was appropriate, if we are making clear to the government of Israel that there are these changes that need to be implemented, that we give them an appropriate period of time to implement them. We didn't think it was appropriate to send a letter and just say this has to happen overnight. We give them make clear there's a short window in which we want to see changes because the humanitarian situation is so dire on the ground, but it is appropriate to give them some time to work through the different issues and find ways to get the level of trucks, get the level of food, water, medicine back up to acceptable levels. Yeah, Amara.
Hi, Matt. So the 620I Foreign Assistance Act actually doesn't have the word arbitrarily. You say it's the law, but the NSM 20, which is a memorandum, has the word arbitrarily. So the Foreign Assistance Act says, when it's made known to the President that the government of such country prohibits or otherwise restricts directly or indirectly the transport of delivery of United States humanitarian assistance, it does not have arbitrarily. So given you are already saying humanitarian assistance is very low and putting in front of Israel a bunch of concrete measures on how to improve it, why are you waiting for another 30 days to implement the law?
Because we believe it's appropriate to give them a chance to cure the problem. And international humanitarian law does make exceptions for certain, I'll give you an example. Dual-use items is a good example. If there are dual-use items that legitimately could be used as a military purpose, of course, governments aren't required to let those dual-use items in, which is not to say that they can use that exception as a blanket restriction on anything that can be used as a dual-use item. For example, if there are military movements happening in a certain period of time, governments can restrict the provision of humanitarian aid during that period, because obviously you wouldn't want to put humanitarian workers at jeopardy. So it is not accurate to say that there can be no restrictions. It's that those restrictions ultimately can't block civilians from getting the humanitarian access that they need. And that is what we're focused on doing. And so we think it's appropriate. Ultimately, what we want to see here is results. This isn't about making a rhetorical statement. It's not about making any kind of threats. It's about seeing the situation reversed. And so that the civilians in Gaza who are not getting adequate access to food and medicine and other humanitarian goods today actually see, as a result of our efforts, a change in their daily lives. And that's what we're focused on achieving, and that's what we are trying to achieve through this letter.
Sure, but I guess what I'm trying to get at, and I'll ask you again, is like, we've been at this for over a year now. You have made these warnings dozens of times, if not more, from this podium. Secretary has done it, President of the United States has done it, and yet we're here. Other outlets have reported, that Reuters has reported all the way back in April, that officials from this department have assessed in internal memos that Israel, quote, is persistently and arbitrarily impeding aid in Gaza. So if the law is already being, if it's already doing it, why is the United States waiting?
So first of all, that is not, so we've been over this before, I know, from this podium. There are people that reach that conclusion, and there are people inside this building who reach the opposite conclusion. So I think it's important to state that for the record, that when you have a difficult situations, it's not uncommon for people to reach different assessments. Ultimately, if you look at the last year and our record of working to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza, what you've seen is the U.S. intervening at critical moments. Going back to October 12th, let's not forget that it wasn't October, it was October 16th. So just a few days after October 7th, that the secretary was negotiating with the government of Israel until 2 in the morning in Tel Aviv to get the first trucks into Gaza. I know you were there. And over the coming months have intervened on multiple occasions when we thought the levels of assistance getting in weren't sufficient, when there were policies that needed to be changed, when there are new gates that needed to be opened. We have intervened to get that to happen. And you've seen those results. You've seen us go from 1 crossing being open to 4 crossings being open. And that is the result of U.S. intervention. Now, to answer your question, we have always said that this is an ongoing process, and our assessments are ongoing. They're not static, they're dynamic. And so when the situation changes, our assessments will change and we'll act accordingly. And that's what we're doing.
And how did the Israelis respond to this letter?
They can speak for themselves. I'm not going to speak for them.
Have you received any assurances that they will actually take these concrete measures?
So I'm just not going to speak for them. Those are private diplomatic conversations. They can speak to their reaction.
And one final thing. What is your message to the world when they question U.S. credibility in terms of following through? Because President Biden made a similar threat to cut off or restrict U.S. military aid in April if Israel carried out a major operation in Rafah. Regardless of what you call that operation, Rafah is now like a wasteland. And we have seen one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs being withheld, but everything else, billions of dollars worth of weapons, have continued. So what do you say to people who question the credibility of U.S. in terms of following?
So first of all, I will say, without getting into all of the details, that not all of the premises of that question are accurate when it comes to the communications between us and the government of Israel. What I will say is look at our track record of intervening to get humanitarian assistance in, and look at the fact that when we have seen when we have seen Israel not follow through on the steps that they committed to, and when we have seen the results not measure up to the standards that we expect, we have intervened with them to turn those around. And that's what we did in April. And it wasn't just a letter from the secretary, it was also the president making this clear directly to the Prime Minister of Netanyahu that we needed to see changes, and that our policy would be dependent on the changes that they made. And they made those changes. Now, what we also said is that the changes need to be sustained, and the level of humanitarian assistance needed to be sustained. And over time, we've seen the level come down, which is why we are going back in and making clear now that it needs to be reversed.
Sorry, one really final thing.
You already said one more. I have to go ahead.
At the end of that letter, you also talk about establishing a new channel to raise civilian harm incidents, which sounds in a way incredible because it's been over a year. So can you elaborate a little bit on that effort? What kind of a channel you want to establish? And are you saying that Israelis basically ignored the U.S. in all of the previous communications when U.S. raised its concern about civilian harm?
I'm not going to speak to it beyond the language that's in the letter, other than to say that we continue to see Israel not taking sufficient steps to address civilian harm. And you have to look no further to understand that than the really horrific results over the weekend.
Thank you, Matt. Does this building see any inconsistency between sending a sternly worded letter with a 30-day lead time about humanitarian conditions in Gaza to the Israelis while near simultaneously deploying an advanced anti-missile system with 100 U.S. troops to man it?
No, of course not. We have always made clear that we are committed to the defense of Israel, and that's why you saw the president make the decision that he made, which I will let my colleagues at the Pentagon speak to in detail. But we've also made clear that there are provisions of U.S. law that we follow, and we will always follow those provisions. And part of that is expecting that the Israeli government fully comply with the requirements under international humanitarian law to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets into Gaza.
Sure. I mean, and this is retreading territory that Humaira and Matt just raised with you, but I mean, 6 months ago, there were suspicions that humanitarian law was not being followed by Israeli forces. So why 6 months on, if the situation is similarly deplorable, do you suspect that situation is meaningfully changed?
So you're right; it is a bit of a retread, and I hope you'll accept my apology for giving the same answer to the same question.
Fine.
But I think it is important to be clear that it is because we saw the situation change. I think the premise of the question, the premise of Humaira's question, is that the situation has been static all along. It hasn't been static. When we intervened back in April to make clear that the level of humanitarian assistance getting in wasn't sufficient, we saw it increase. And we saw that increase sustained for a period of time, but then not long enough, and it came back down. And so we're going to respond to events as they happen. And when humanitarian assistance increases and is an acceptable level, you won't see us raising those concerns. But when we see the situation on the ground that we've seen over the past few months, when we see the level of humanitarian assistance in September, the lowest it has been in any month since the war began, it's appropriate for us to intervene in this way.
And to briefly address the flip side, I mean, the Israeli argument is that allowing this aid in provides fuel for Hamas. They run a protection racket, they get money, they get funds, essentially they think that taking this step is effectively choking off Hamas. Does the U.S. dispute that is a reason why the Israelis are limiting this aid?
So there are, without a doubt, security concerns inside Gaza that make it difficult to deliver aid, that has led to the looting of humanitarian assistance in some cases. But the answer to that is not to stop the flow of food and water that civilians depend on, and that little babies and children need to survive. That cannot be the answer to that problem. The ultimate answer to that problem is to establish a governing authority in Gaza that can provide safety and security for the Palestinian people of Gaza, that can provide safety and security for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, that can provide a long-term political path forward, as we have been making clear for some time. The answer absolutely cannot in any way be penalizing the innocent civilians who depend on this food, water, medicine to live.
Okay, I don't want to monopolize time. I have two more.
All right, you've been listening to the State Department spokesman Matt Miller addressing the U.S. pressure on Israel to boost humanitarian intervention in Gaza. That came in the form of a letter that the U.S. considered a private diplomatic communication. The letter not kept public, though. We do not know why. We do not know who let it out into the public domain, but officials in the U.S. are now having to answer questions about the contents of that communication, saying that Israel just isn't doing enough to provide humanitarian aid. You see Miller there. He highlighted over and over and over. At points, Israel increased assistance, but they want to make it very clear, especially in this letter, that they don't want to be accused of being a part of assistance just being a one-off. They want sustained humanitarian aid, so they're pushing for that. Meanwhile, we are looking live at the Pentagon, where you see a microphone there and a podium. The Pentagon getting ready to have a daily briefing. What will they say about this and other matters in our world? CBS News 24/7 back in just a moment. All right, 21 days until Election Day, and the battleground blitz continues with stops in Michigan by Kamala Harris, Georgia very much on the mind of Donald Trump. These are crucial territories with a collective 50 electoral votes up for grabs. Meanwhile, CBS News hearing for the first time from the man arrested outside of Donald Trump's rally in Southern California. Let's go to CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland. Scott, you spoke to this man, Ben Miller, on the phone. What does he say about the charges?
This is quite a tale, Reed. Ben Miller was accused by a local sheriff in California of potentially being an assassin, that this was an attempted assassination on Saturday when Miller was stopped with firearms and ammo allegedly in his car. Ben Miller says he is a longtime Trump supporter, has been a Trump volunteer in Nevada, has been in proximity to Donald Trump at least 20 times in the past, was at the Republican National Convention, and that all of these accusations are false. He's facing just 2 misdemeanor charges, allegedly for having the guns and a high-capacity magazine in his car unlawfully, but faces no other accusations. Federal law enforcement sources said there's no indication this was an assassination attempt, and federal investigators have said publicly, Reed, that Donald Trump was in no danger Saturday in Coachella at that event. So you have 2 very different stories being told by federal law enforcement and this local sheriff in California. We have reached out to the sheriff for comment about his claims of an attempted assassination. We hadn't heard back as the afternoon began here in Washington. Ben Miller says this has caused quite a disruption in his life. All these accusations, he's considering a civil lawsuit, and he thinks that he can find a way to get that file before his next court date, which is January 2nd.
Miller, an interesting character. I lived and worked in Las Vegas for years. He is known to many people in that city. Scott, while we have you, there are talk of investigations that continue in the attempted assassinations in Butler, Pennsylvania, and also in Florida. What's on the road ahead for those 2 investigations?
What about these 2 alleged attempted assassinations from the summer? Well, first of all, the incident in West Palm Beach, Florida, in mid-September is now in court. Ryan Ruth's the defendant. He has a court date in the coming weeks. But the one in Butler, Pennsylvania, remains the subject of multiple investigations, not just the congressional panels that are looking into this, what went wrong, how the Secret Service may have failed, and how to prevent a future such incident. But we know the Secret Service is doing its own internal review as well, with a report coming potentially in the coming days. We'd expect these reviews to point out vulnerabilities that need to be patched up, either with more money, with changes in policies, changes in staffing, changes in staffing levels. All these investigations will answer some questions about July 13th, but Reed, I think more importantly for some folks, they will prescriptively discuss what should happen next to prevent any future recurrence.
CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland, we know as soon as that report is available, you will bring it to us. Thank you so much. Always good talking to you. All right, from Scott back here in the United States, Floridians are working to pump the water out of their homes in the aftermath of Hurricane Milton. But in some places, progress moves backward. We're talking about floodwaters continuing to inch higher. More than 100,000 Floridians at this hour know that they are going into the afternoon and evening hours without electricity once again. There are some signs of improvement because of hard work by first responders. Gas stations are back open. State roads are now clear. Students are heading back to school little by little. Now let's move to North Carolina, where we watched the aftermath of the hurricane that came before Milton, and that's Helene. Similar problem. Thousands still without electricity there, and they also have the added problem of sand and mud piling up around homes and also inside of homes. North Carolina's governor talked about the risks of misinformation affecting the recovery effort, especially near Chimney Rock, North Carolina.
There's still a persistent and dangerous flow of misinformation about recovery efforts in Western North Carolina that can lead to threats and intimidation, breeds confusion, and demoralizes storm survivors and response workers alike. If you're participating in spreading this stuff, stop it. Whatever your aim is, the people you are really hurting are those in Western North Carolina who need help. The safety of our government and volunteer response workers, including FEMA, remains a top priority. I've directed the Department of Public Safety to coordinate law enforcement assistance for FEMA and other responders who need it to help ensure their safety and security so people can keep getting the help that they desperately need.
All right, speaking of Chimney Rock, and that area just wiped out, CBS News national correspondent Janet Shemley on tracking the progress in communities where those high floodwaters cut off help for days. Janet.
So it's been almost 3 weeks since Helene hit, and we've been in and around other Western North Carolina towns like Asheville and here in Old Fort to see the damage. But what we're just getting a look at, the community of Chimney Rock, is eye-opening. It has been closed off for the better part of 2 weeks because the access roads just weren't there. You can finally get in one way to Chimney Rock, which is a small community of only about 100 people. And the only people being allowed in right now are residents and first responders. And we got to look at the utter devastation, the flooding, the mud-filled homes, as you can see from the pictures, is just horrific, and it's going to be a years-long recovery. Part of the problem is not just the power outages, the fact that there's no telecom, Wi-Fi right now. It's the infrastructure. It's the roads leading in and out of communities like Chimney Rock. Unless you can repair that road and get the Army Corps of Engineers to solidify some of the roads that look like they're about to cave further, you can't get to the other necessary rescue tactics that need to happen in these communities. And you talk about people leaving forever and not coming back when you see communities like Chimney Rock. We talked to owners yesterday who said absolutely they're rebuilding. I mean, this family had the first floor of their home covered in mud. They used it as sort of an Airbnb type thing at their property, and they're determined to come back. The other interesting takeaway from our first look at Chimney Rock is just the amount of church groups and volunteers and people who have no stake in the community of Chimney Rock, who've come from elsewhere in North Carolina, from out of state, just to be muddy and literally just to dig this place out of hell. And that's exactly what it is. And it was very inspiring to see that. There are federal and local resources on the ground, but their numbers are limited, even though there are plenty of them. But where you really see the rubber meet the road is with these volunteers who are coming in and just doing the work that needs to be done. And the people in these communities, I can tell you, are grateful for it. Back to you.
Janet, thank you so much. Our best to the people in North Carolina. And Jess, you are watching the season because we're not done yet.
We're not even close. I mean, we still have 6 weeks left of hurricane season. As we track the tropics this morning, heading into this afternoon, we're continuing to see mostly calm conditions thanks to a huge, strong area of low pressure and just a cold front that swept down into Florida throughout this afternoon, leaving behind mild conditions throughout the tropics. So let's dive into that forecast right now. That cold front swept throughout the Northeast, and if you live up there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Our temperatures today about about 15 to 20 degrees below where we usually are for this time of year. And as that system continued to sweep to the south, it's allowing for more mild weather in the tropics. Now, don't get me wrong, we still have some light thunderstorm activity closer to the Keys throughout this afternoon, and flood warnings are still in effect throughout most of the rivers in Florida after Hurricane Milton swept throughout that whole state just last week. Now, as we take a quick look at what's happening, though, off into the east, tracking the tropics, the National Hurricane Center is only keeping an eye on one system right now when it comes to cyclonic activity, and it's this one just right here with about a 30% chance of formation within the next 2 days. So relatively quiet right now, but we will continue to monitor that system as it gets closer. However, for the time being, they are dealing with mild weather down in Florida, well below average conditions all throughout the Northeast.
Okay, Jess, thank you. We are monitoring the Pentagon right now. As promised, the Pentagon giving a live update at this very minute on Middle East and humanitarian aid, that private dispatch that's now been made public between the United States and Israel. Here's Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh.
And issues among world's leading democratic economies. Later on in the trip, Secretary Austin will conclude with an official engagement in Vatican City. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Tara, and I know that was a lot at the top.
That was a lot. That's good.
Yeah.
All right. So with the Secretary's consultations with Minister Gallant over the last couple of weeks since Iran's ballistic missile attack, has he been encouraging Israel to not retaliate against Iran's oil facilities or nuclear facilities? And is he encouraged by indications that that Israel may avoid those targets?
So thanks, Tara, for the question. So as you saw over the weekend, the Secretary spoke with Minister Gallant twice. I don't have more to provide beyond those readouts. Again, speculating on a potential response from Israel, I'd refer you to them to speak to their own operations, but I just don't have more to provide than those readouts.
Okay, so trying it from another angle then, would the Secretary prefer that Israel not strike Iran's nuclear facilities?
Appreciate the question in a different angle. I'm not going to be able to provide more than the readouts. The Secretary, as we've said from for a few weeks now, we continue to engage the Israelis on and speak with them about what their response might look like. But I'm just not going to be able to provide more on that. Natasha.
Thanks, Sabrina. So in the letter that Secretary Austin co-authored with Secretary Blinken to the Israelis, I believe it was sent earlier this week, was that letter specifically a threat that the U.S. military is not going to be able to provide weapons to Israel anymore if they do not, within 30 days, get more aid into Gaza? It was a little bit vague in its wording. It kind of said that there will be implications for U.S. law if they don't change what they're doing. But is this specifically a threat to withhold certain forms of military assistance if they don't move forward with changing the aid to Gaza?
So in terms of the letter that you referenced, I can confirm that Secretary Austin with Secretary Blinken, they co-signed a letter that went to their Israeli counterparts. This was personal, private correspondence, so I'm not going to get into more specifics of it other than it was expressing concern about the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, but beyond that, I'm just not going to be able to provide more details.
How can you say that it's personal and private when it's the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense sending a letter?
The Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State can send private correspondence to their Israeli counterparts or counterparts all over the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that those letters need to be public. I understand that there is reporting out there and imagery out there of a letter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a public letter for public consumption. It was, can I just finish? It was private correspondence because it was addressed to their Israeli counterparts, both of them. They send letters all the time to, whether it be to members of Congress or their counterparts all over the world that are not intended for public consumption. So the letters weren't addressed to, Associated Press or to Fox. It was addressed to two people, to their counterparts, and it was a letter that, I'm just not going to get into private correspondence beyond that.
It's on U.S. government letterhead, correct?
I cannot.
It's private. Is it like on pink stationery, or is it on letterhead from the U.S.
I would assume it was on letterhead.
All right, you've been listening to word from the Pentagon, similar line of questions that we heard just a little while ago here on CBS News 24/7. focused on Matt Miller over at the State Department, and that is that private dispatch encouraging Israel to really ramp up in dramatic ways humanitarian assistance in Gaza, saying that help military-wise for Israel, well, they're watching it closely if Israel doesn't ramp up the humanitarian efforts. Much more on CBS News 24/7 about that dispatch and about decisions in the Middle East as it relates to the United States and Israel.